Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Long Game Podcast with myself, Ben Scallon, and from my perspective, my grayscale co-host, Jason Osborne, because I'm actually currently in the middle of a dopamine detox. And so one of the recommendations I've read is that you should turn down the saturation on all your screens. Obviously, you try to use technology as little as you can, cut it to a bare minimum. Obviously, we have to use it for work, for things like this, but currently everything is gray and very artistic. It kind of adds a flair to it. It's like I'm watching a French movie every time I have a video call with somebody now.
I would say between your new grayscale world and your obsessive timekeeping, the human experience is a hell of a thing. It can be stretched very far, and yours is about as mechanical as it gets currently by the sound of things.
Yeah, it's really weird. Like, I think that if anybody was to try and live my life, they would just be, it's almost like Leonardo da Vinci, the way he used to write in code. You couldn't keep up with all the weird habits and hang-ups. But for real, I don't know how many people are familiar with this dopamine detox concept, where you spend a period of your choosing, it could be a month. I'm doing a month for the time being and seeing where it goes, and not having any junk food, not listening to any music of any kind, or even like a podcast or an audiobook, nothing like that. Not watching any TV, no video games, no unnecessary social media unless you literally need it for work. And already, I've only been doing it for a couple of days, and already I can feel my attention span, like my instinct while I'm working. I keep, as a knee-jerk reaction, going to put on a music in the background while I'm working, because that's what I would typically do, and I have to keep stopping myself at the last second and going, no, wait, let me like recalibrate here. But the idea is, after a period of this, a substantial enough period, you get to the point where you can appreciate little things again. Silence. If you're just sitting on the train, you can read a book, or just sit there and actually look around and observe the real world that you live in, which is something that I haven't done in a long time. Yeah, you start to just notice beautiful moments that otherwise you wouldn't, because you're more attuned to what's going on. So
It's crazy what a hyper stimulated world we live in. Like, I've never done an official dopamine detox or whatever, but I don't know if you remember, a couple of years back I did I didn't do anything in particular other than that I was sort of moving in a general direction where I went back to a button phone. I had a Blockia, and that was great. I deactivated all of my social media. This was obviously before I got into news and journalism, because you'd last about, I don't know, 10 minutes without your connection as a journalist. Deleted all social media. I just wasn't really using the internet at all. And it's kind of like blank slate human existence, where obviously you're able to get dopamine in man's natural state because it existed there prior to all of our stimulation. But I imagine it is much closer to the natural experience of man, to put it that way, because we just live in this hyper stimulated society, and it kind of is like coming down off a high when you, as I say, undertake something like this. It's pretty shocking actually how hard it is.
yeah, I've heard that after a week or two, it's common that you almost feel borderline depressed, because all the little things that would normally give you solace in your life are suddenly not available, and you're like, damn, I can't even listen to like Mozart, not even my usual music. Like, I couldn't even listen to something that's kind of highbrow, because that's part of it, is you have to try and detach from all artificial sources of pleasure. But once you get over that hump where you feel like crap for a little while, your brain starts to chemically reset, and then you feel fantastic, and then you actually have a great attention span. You feel more focused. I'm not speaking from experience here. I've never done this before, so I'll report back in a few weeks when the experiment is concluded. But this is what I'm hearing people say, is that it just allows you to feel good. Like you'll see a sunset and damn near start crying, that kind of way.
Wow.
Now, well, we'll be your accountability partners now, because it's always the case whenever people take up newfangled schemes that they're always like saying, "Oh, I unlocked this crazy ability that we used to have, but we don't have anymore." Like, I don't know, I'm using 100% of my brain now, whereas the rest of you are only using like 30% or something like this. So
You start. I can hear the wing beats of a butterfly, and that kind of thing. I'm levitating this much off the ground suddenly.
But yeah, well, you'll have to let us know how it goes. I mean, if people see you acting bizarrely in public now, they know why.
Well, that could be one of any number of things, to be honest. But we might move on with that to our topics this week. Jason, I believe you had an interesting story there about the Leaving Cert climate activism module, which is quite explicitly geared towards activism. I believe we, on a previous episode, were talking about this Leaving Cert new subject that they were putting forward.
Yeah.
We were saying how, there's a lot of activism in it. And we were kind of inferring that from the material, where you look at it and you go,
Exactly.
this looks very activisty, but that word wasn't used. But now the people behind the course have effectively come out and said explicitly, yes, we want to turn kids into activists. That is the point of it. So that's now out in the open, and I believe you submitted an FOI on this, which garnered some interesting results.
Yeah, so there's a couple updates, and really, I think this one's really important, because I think this course is a bit of a watershed where, traditionally, excessively political school courses were understood as being a bad thing, and the reasons for that are pretty obvious. Whereas with this one, it's kind of just as though they're saying, the climate is so important, and the state of the climate is so important that it's completely justified to introduce like activism as an element of this. And this is actually aside from my article, which we'll get into in a minute. But on Friday, even RT had an article up from their education correspondent, Emma O'Kelly, about how the new Leaving Cert course aims to encourage climate activism. That's literally the headline on it. And it speaks about how, let me just skip into it because they speak to someone who was involved in sort of putting it together. They speak about how, like during COVID, they noticed that, I don't know, a lot of students sort of tuned out and became withdrawn and things like this. And prior to the pandemic, they had seen sort of students getting involved in the international student protest movements by Greta Thunberg and things. So one school decided to capitalize on this, and they had students protesting outside City Hall and whatnot. And then this woman, anyway, Deputy Principal Kathleen O'Brien, as I say, who I think is with Kinsale Community School, which will be one of the 43 schools piloting this subject come November. She said that she felt their students should have the opportunity within our school to learn about this stuff, that is like, climate issues and the activism around it, to become more empowered and informed. And she's quoted, and she says, there's literally this in the article. The most unusual feature of the new subject is its focus on activism. For a formal school subject, this is a new departure, and it is one that Miss O'Brien welcomes. And it quotes her. She says, the fact that students can now study this subject is absolutely amazing, and it's going to change lives. We need students who will become activists. So, like, I don't know about you, I find this absolutely shocking that this is just being said out and out. I mean, as I said, traditionally it was understood that education really ought not to be promoting activists for causes. It ought to be promoting, critical thinking and the ability to engage with different topics, and just so that students can decide for themselves whether things are good or bad. But to sort of segue into the story that I had, which, as you say, a while back when when the sample exam papers came out for this subject, I submitted some FOIs because I thought they were very activistic in their orientation. Like, they were using phrases like environmental racism. They were encouraging students to consider the effect of colonialism on climate change and all of these things. And there were like questions about whether controls on the media are satisfactory for controlling sort of misinformation, disinformation, and things like this around climate, which is like, again, this is all just like so crazy, except for the fact that this is a Leaving Cert subject that's coming in come September. So anyway, on the foot of that, I submitted some FOIs, and what came back was very interesting, because though the documents that I received very much gave the impression that opposition to this was quite widespread. Like there was more opposition to this. The sort of quantitative data that I got back was very limited. It wasn't overly helpful, but what it indicated was that opposition to this course and the feeling that it was inappropriate far outstripped support for it, and indeed outstripped the people who were just sort of neutral towards it. And I just have the article here in front of me about how, like, there was a line in the internal NCCA report which said that the response to the draft specification was very polarized, with occasionally neutral responses outweighed by a majority either strongly in favor of or strongly opposed to the introduction of climate action and sustainable development as a subject. And as I say, when you look at the limited data that was given, the number that were strongly opposed to typically outweighed the number who were strongly in favor of. They included that line in the publicly available consultation synthesis, but they prefaced it with a note that the response to the draft specification was positive overall. So I don't know where they drew that from. It's like, so you had these results that were mainly negative, overwhelmingly in disagreement with it, and then they say, oh, it's mostly positive, and that's
you know what, this is conjecture on my part. I'm not saying this is the case, and maybe you can shed a little bit of light on this, but from having dealt with similar crap prior with different public consultations on different issues, such as the hate speech bill, for example, one of the tricks they use, which is extremely cheap and deceptive, is they'll do a whole load of strands of consultations. And so they'll have one that's for random punters in the general public, and then they'll have one that's for organizations, i.e. NGOs and state agencies and groups like that, and maybe one for like academics or something. And they'll find that the public is overwhelmingly opposed to whatever it is and tells them to show it up their ass sideways. But then 10 NGOs and 3 academics said, actually, we think it's class. Go on, you mad thing. And they'll say, well, on balance, like 90% of the 10 NGOs we asked, all of whom we pay, by the way, said that it's worth going ahead with. So really, and look, there was unanimous consensus among the academics we asked. Oh yeah, how many did you ask? 5. Okay, yeah. Very compelling, isn't it? Really, when you put these things together, they're the same, aren't they? No, they're not. So anyway, I'm not saying that's what happened in this instance, but that might be how they're trying to compartmentalize this to create a ridiculous picture of what's actually happening.
Well, I think that dynamic is certainly present in it, because like there was one question in it, say, about how examples of the key competencies can be developed or appropriate for climate action and sustainable development. And again, the majority, they didn't include a key with this graph, which is included in the article if people are interested in looking, which is just sort of sloppy generally. But you kind of could strongly infer based on the other ones that, again, a majority expressed strong disagreement with this. But in a sort of paragraph before it, they said, many respondents were from agencies not involved in post-primary education or where parents were concerned citizens and do not have experience of senior cycle key competencies. So I kind of read that as them kind of saying, the majority of these people don't know what they're talking about. Now, as I say, I'm always unwilling to attribute, unless we sort of have, direct evidence of something motive to anyone in this, because that's, a notoriously difficult thing to do. They have difficulty doing that in criminal courts. They have difficulty doing that, at the highest level. So it's not good to do here. But the overall effect of all of this is that in the final publicly available consultation synthesis that they received, the impression is very, very much conveyed that there was little opposition to this. As I said, despite a sort of throwaway line about how there was opposition to this, but mostly it was overwhelmingly positive, this kind of double think sentence. But the impression is very much conveyed that what disagreement there was over the specifics of the thing, and overall people think this is a good subject and the thrust of it is necessary and it's all well and good and we should barrel on ahead with it. Whereas, again, based on what we saw, that's very much not the case. I have a paragraph again in the article which people can go and read about how let me just pull it up here. Some of the negative, where do I have it? Yeah, say that a considerable number of respondents express negative views about the specification and consider that climate action and sustainable development is not an appropriate subject for the Leaving Certificate. They go on to talk about how, in the internal report, so there was an underlying suggestion across many of these responses of a politicization of the education system. And there was a bunch of people saying that it's inappropriate to reference action in the draft specification and that the inclusion of action taking sort of promotes civil disobedience, with a bunch of people citing things like neo-Marxism, North Korean communism, indoctrination, and far-left divisive ideologies. So whether or not you agree with the specifics of, those charges, there was a lot of unrest about this. And as I say, when you read the final publicly produced synthesis document on the consultations, they pay lip service to the disagreement, but very much just give the impression that it was, well and good, and we should be going ahead with it. And this really shouldn't just be, taken, I suppose, lying down, to put it that way, because a second kind of part of the article, I had another one of the documents that I got, was one of the consultation things was an in-person thing in a hotel last March that there was 35 participants at. Those participants might have been organizations with multiple people, and they didn't really break it down properly. But so one of the documents I got was sort of this anonymized feedback sheet where they just sort of amalgamated all of the feedback. And the tone of this feedback is, you would think to the moderate mind, mad. So it keeps, as it says, all anonymous, so you don't know who was saying this exactly, but people were calling the specification brave and timely. One of the sentences said, "It's so brave, but is it too brave? Is it too much?" Another one was saying, I won't give away the whole article. There's a lot more in here anyway for people who want to read, but there's another one talking about how the people behind the course ought to try and resist the guaranteed detractors, not let them steer those designing the course off the brave path that they're developing for young people, and it exhorts them to resist. So these are like, again, some of the, and again, you're quite right to say, like, there's a bunch of different dynamics at play in the consultations, but there was clearly very activistic elements involved in the input in this. And it seems to me, having looked at all of this, that's the voice that had the final say. And if I were a parent, well, I'm a parent, but if I were a parent of school-going kids, I would be up in arms about this, because it just strikes me as totally inappropriate.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of schooling is to teach children how to think, not what to think. That's kind of a very basic tenet of education, I would have thought, that you are exposed to a whole variety of information. You're taught incontrovertible facts that we know that are demonstrated to be provably true, in nature. And you're taught, if you are exposed to subjective viewpoints, it's in a setting of debate, let's say, where, you can take one position and somebody else takes another, and you have to learn how to defend your view and not straw man your opposite, things like that. That's about the only real room you could have for that sort of subjective view. And when it comes to this issue, we could get into the validity and the legitimacy of some of the more apocalyptic climate projections and whether those are realistic and the planet is actually going to be burnt to a cinder in 5 minutes. I could get into that. Whenever you start getting into that, people start saying, "Oh, well, where's your climate degree? You're, trust the experts, blah, blah, blah." Okay, fine.
Now you're doing your dopamine detox, I would say you're specially qualified to comment on the state of your surroundings.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm probably perceiving things that I'm on, like, another level, another plane of existence.
You can hear the ice caps melting.
Yeah. But with all that said, they're going to push back if you start getting into the scientific argument and questioning the data. So let's just give it to them for the sake of argument and say, yes, every single thing you say is correct. Man-made climate change is destroying the world and we're all about to die. Okay, grand. Still, it is a subjective point to start prescribing a policy solution to that. What is the answer to those particular problems? That's a matter of personal opinion. You have lunatics like Extinction Rebellion who want to glue themselves to planes and they think that that's an appropriate way to go about it, or smash windows and engage in criminal damage and vandalism. And then you have somebody like Eamon Ryan who wants to go into government and try to fix things through policy and passing legislation. And so there's a whole range of directions you can go within that. So even granting them absolutely everything, even if we fully accepted the climate alarmist worldview, that still would not justify teaching kids and directing them on how to go about fixing problems in society. That's not the job of education. It just isn't.
Well, one of the, yeah, certainly. And, there was, even aside from the documents that I received, there is a lot of sort of talk around it as to how do they phrase it, the affective dimension of the subject, which is that it will, this subject will likely stimulate some eco-anxiety, as they put it, in students and things like that. And there's, which, I would also say is inappropriate, but we're far beyond that, unfortunately. But there was also, in one of the documents I received, there was a line about how it was something along the lines of, students will be, gosh, let me find it, because this is complicated stuff and you don't necessarily to get it wrong. But it said something to the effect that a subject like this will promote harmony, and or the way the subject is conveyed is that it will promote harmony and get everyone on the same page into relation to all of these things. Whereas it's much more likely that what this will do is stoke division in school communities in relation to things that aren't directly connected to climate, you would think. So it was saying that it might stoke division in relation to sixth year holidays. And I read this, the students who take this might start taking issue with all the other students who go away on planes at the end of the year and things like this. The students who take this might start taking issue with going on school trips and whatnot. So just as you say, sort of this, rosy worldview where, everyone's on the same page about what to do and we're all unified in climate action. Whereas the much more likely outcome of this is, division. It's, division in terms of, promoting activism and through that sort of civil disobedience. It's division in school communities between the students who, end up taking this and then start thinking it's inappropriate for their fellow students to be going on sixth year holidays. It's
sorry to joke, but Elon Musk, people associate him with the rightest of the right, like he's this far right lunatic or whatever. Elon Musk is a climate change guy. Every single thing that he's done in his career, in the last decade or so at least, has been oriented towards overcoming climate change as a threat to humanity, because he fully believes in that. That's why he rolled out electric cars and popularized them with Tesla. That's why I don't know if a lot of people know this, the reason he's obsessed with colonizing Mars and other planets is not just because he thinks that'd be a cool thing to do, although I'm sure he does think it's cool. It's specifically so that if and when humanity finds some way to annihilate our own planet because we're such idiots, that we will have a backup plan and that there will be people living on another, planetary body, that the Earth is not our only basket that we have all of our eggs in. So my point being, the only reason I bring that up is that is a proposed solution to climate change. He's not even saying everybody needs to try and run around gluing themselves to this or gluing themselves to that, or increase your taxes to the point where poor people can't afford to turn on their heating. He wants to explore other planets and shoot rockets off into space. So the range of discussion you can have, even within their worldview, is enormous. And to act like it is confined to some kind of very narrow, specific set of policies that we all agree on is just laughable. I know I'm just reiterating what we said, but I think it's worth reinforcing the point.
It's important to do so because it's crazy. As I said, this is going to be rolled out in a select number of schools come September. And if I remember correctly, this subject to correction on this, it'll be rolled out sort of to all schools come 2027 or so. So it's an important one, and it's because school is, again, say traditionally understood as being important because we put all of our young people through it, and it's where they come into contact with, ideas, and it's where traditionally they were sort of, intellectually formed and things like this. Whereas, as that RT article even noted itself, this is a departure for traditional school subjects. This, to include an element on active, particularly, just even aside from the climate ideas themselves, to include an element of activism, because activism just implies that this is the right thing to do, and don't, why would you question it? It's like the planet's dying, so we all have to get out there and get busy, which is just, it's just crazy to me that this passed all of the whatever checks they have in the background. I mean, as I say, when you have a sort of look into the consultation process as we did, it's not that hard to see why it was sort of shooed along, because there's clearly a lot of you would say stakeholders in favor of something like this, and I suppose to hell with the people who don't think it's a good idea from the off. But so I would encourage people to go read the article, because there's a lot more in there than we even spoke about here, and I just really think this is a very important one, because as I described it at the beginning, I think this subject is a bit of a watershed moment, in that there's never been a subject, to my knowledge, like this before in Irish schools. And I think if it's just allowed to slide, it sort of opens the door to all sorts of potential, just taking ideas, I would say bad ideas, for granted as right and true, and, telling students to act on the basis of those ideas rather than to consider them. So it's an important one, I think, for people to read up on and consider themselves, especially if they've kids of school going age.
I don't want this to happen. I don't encourage this. This is not something that I would desire or try to have happen myself. However, I would find it very funny if in the future a right-wing government was to achieve power in this country and then start doing the exact same thing but pushing conservative values within the education system or something like that. I wouldn't call for that. I wouldn't want it. But if that was to happen, they literally would not have a leg to stand on as far as complaints go. You would just have to sit there and suck it up, because they have now set the precedent for something like that happening. And so they have no one to blame but themselves.
That point was made. I saw one or two people making it on X after RT shared the article, which was like, okay, say you had a government of a different bent, what would be wrong then with, schools introducing a pro-life activism component in their subjects? It's like, it's just a question of which worldview you think is valid. It's like, clearly our current, reigning zeitgeist in Ireland thinks the pro-life perspective should be largely nonsense. But as you say, if in the future you were to change tack and you had a government that thought pro-life activism should be considered, the people who are supportive of this current curriculum would have no leg to stand on in arguing against it, because that's precisely what you guys did. This is definitely one to keep an eye on, and hopefully there'll be more of interest to come along these lines.
Most definitely. And speaking of worrying precedents, that's not worrying for you or me, but this next one is worrying for somebody. Sinn Féin, our friends over at Sinn Féin, have been banned from the trans and intersex pride march in Dublin that's coming up this year. And I'm sure that was a devastating blow for them. But as I reported over the weekend, and many publications reported on this, Sinn Féin has been banned from attending Trans and Intersex Pride Dublin 2025, with organisers stating that they are not satisfied with the party's position on trans healthcare and a recent UK Supreme Court ruling. And so this one, I'm sure you recall, Jason, and many of our viewers will recall that Sinn Féin has been doing a bit of a jig on this particular issue for quite some time, where last year the NHS and various British healthcare professionals were questioning the safety and validity of puberty blockers for children as a valid medical procedure, let's say. Is this actually something that we should be doing to kids? And so Sinn Féin, very controversially, opted to block that in the UK temporarily, or in Northern Ireland, should I say, temporarily, where they said, we're not going to use this anymore. We're going to have a 3-month suspension on it while we assess the safety, because we don't want to take any unnecessary risks. So that automatically looks like they're kind of climbing down from the trans thing. And the problem for them in that context is that a lot of their audience and their kind of core constituent demographic that they're trying to appeal to are left-wing and far-left people who passionately believe in this stuff. Like, I don't want to get personal. I don't like talking about people's families, and so I'm not saying this in a critical manner. I'm just saying it as a matter of fact that Mary Lou McDonald's own sibling is transgender, identifies as transgender. So, the party is very torn on this issue, shall we say. The working class, inner city kind of dub is not going to be particularly pleased with this stuff being in their kids' schools in the context of the conversation we were having earlier, or just generally being rammed down their throat when most people consider this to be unscientific hogwash. And they also have to try and placate the mad activist lunatics who are within their base who will be up in arms if they... So they're kind of in a bind here. So anyway, David Cullinane, their health spokesman, really landed the minute by telling the truth by accident a couple of and then thinking better of it just a couple of weeks ago when the UK Supreme Court had a ruling that the definition of woman is based on biology. So in other words, if you are a woman, that means you have female genitalia, female chromosomes, etc., and it doesn't really matter how you identify. And so this was a landmark ruling for obvious reasons. This has now been codified in law by the highest court in the land, so that's kind of a big deal. And so David Cullinane, after this happened, he came out and he said, I'm glad of this. I'm paraphrasing, but he effectively said, look, this is a good ruling. It's common sense. Hopefully we'll see something like that here. And of course, the explosion of rage was practically biblical in response. So he then had to do a big climb down and say, well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be insensitive, and he deleted it. And then they had to meet with all these different transgender organizations like Tenny. They did a whole apology tour behind the scenes, mind you. We weren't privy to this until it came out in media reports after the fact. But behind closed doors, they were trying to talk everybody down from the ledge and say, oh, don't worry, we're on your side. Himself and Mary Lou were there doing the mea culpa. And so, anyway, apparently it wasn't enough and it was not sufficiently persuasive, because they've now been banned from the trans and intersex Pride March, and they don't know what to be doing with themselves. I saw actually a press release they just put out there like 2 days ago after this had come to light, where they were almost trying to put out the fire saying, today is International Day of Transgender and non-binary Day of Visibility, or whatever the hell. There's like one of these damn festivals for every day of the week, so I don't know what one it was specifically, but anyway, again, trying to reaffirm that we're on their side. But when they're walking around Coolock or Dublin Central of Mary Lou McDonald's constituency, do you think she's bringing this stuff up on the doors? Do you think she's gonna lead with that as their kind of flagship policy? I think not. So anyway, it's look, you want to kind of give people their due, and there's always a little bit of give and take when it comes to politics, but they really they have no true position on this. Their position will literally change depending on who they're talking to from 1 hour to the next. It's unbelievable.
But the Cullinane stuff was it was pure Orwellian. Like his reaction to the court ruling over in the UK, that was clearly his genuine reaction. Like he saw this and he was like, "Oh, great!" Like the vast majority of the country was like a common sense ruling at last. It was only when the pressure applied.
It's kind of like when he said "up the Ra" after he won in 2020. It's like sometimes you just want to be you,
Which is to the political party like like so many of them, I say, that has sort of no moral spine. Let this be a lesson not to have like particularly excitable people in your midst, because they're liable to let their true feelings slip, and then you're gonna have to apologize when it outrages particularly vocal elements of society. But this is just so Orwellian, because clearly he voiced his actual opinion on this, and then once the pressure was applied, he had to essentially admit 2 plus 2 is 5 because what was it that he was sort of essentially forced to say that transgender women are in fact women, something like this, like a complete denial of reality. So I just find the whole spectacle very depressing, actually, because it's just whereas this question is sort of being approached with a more with the whole trans question is being approached with a more again, to use the phrase we've used a couple of times today, commonsensical view in, say, the US and in the UK now, even if the battle isn't the war isn't entirely won. In Ireland, this still very much has not been settled. A lot of the NGOs and interest groups have a lot of sway still in Irish civil society, and so it is very important that essentially episodes like this are ridiculed because it's the reason this sort of progressive consensus has been built in Ireland is because it was sort of intimidating and there were sort of social consequences, I suppose, for expressing the sort of views that Cullinane did initially. Whereas I don't know, I think we're quickly finding ourselves out of step with the rest of the Western world on this one anyway, because these ideologies always had a shelf life. I mean, it's dying elsewhere. It will die here. It's just a question of how long is it going to take people to be brave, stop lying down every time someone gets a little bit annoyed at them.
Yeah, I mean, think about how much better it would have done for them as a party if they had just said, "Yeah, no, that's our position." But again, you see, I really, really don't want to get personal. I'm not attacking anyone involved, but I do feel like Mary Lou McDonald's personal tie here is a very difficult problem for them because she really cannot. She's pretty much locked into that position. Otherwise, it's a very important personal relationship. I mean, who wants to fall out with their immediate family member, like a sibling who you love? You can't do that. Like, that's not to say you can't have hard conversations with your siblings or disagree on things. But anyway, I don't want to pry into the relationship. I don't know what the relationship is like, so it's not my place to get into that. All I'm saying is it would be much simpler if that complicating factor was not there. If they could just jettison it and say, yeah, look, we don't believe in that. And we're going to go with where the general public seems to be drifting. They're kind of screwed because that's not such an easy transition for them due to the specific circumstance they're in.
No, it is a good opportunity to note that, like, no one is denying that these are very, because I think on the pure level of the culture war over this stuff, it's very liable to sort of be taken lightly or just ridiculed or whatever. And that's well and good because a lot of the philosophy underlying this stuff is crap. But when you're dealing with someone who genuinely thinks they're, the opposite sex or genuinely thinks they should be born as the opposite sex, you're ridiculing them and just doing things like that. That's not, I would personally say it's not the right approach. It's like, you're dealing with someone, and this kind of the approach, you and I are both Catholic, and sort of the approach the church traditionally takes with things is a pastoral approach, which is kind of trying to meet people where they're at and over time guiding them back into the truth and things like this. And so I can totally understand how, it's a lot easier to, be very sort of stalwart on this issue when you have no personal stake in it. But again, none of this changes the fact that, truth is truth. And just because it's hard to kind of speak it or kind of hard to dialogue with people who are affected by it, it doesn't mean you should give that up, because you start getting yourself into all sorts of difficulty when you do give it up, as David Cullinane is finding, and as Sinn Féin more broadly is finding consistently on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I heard Matt Walsh, who's obviously done a huge amount on this particular issue. This is kind of his main issue, if you wanted to put it that way. Matt Walsh of the Daily Wire, and he was talking about it, and I thought he made a great observation that there is a certain cohort of people who, for psychological and emotional reasons, can never and will never let this go. Even when the vast majority of society has moved on and we've all almost unanimously accepted, yeah, no, there's no validity to this. A man is somebody with a penis and that's the end of it, and we're just going to drive ahead and forget the whole thing ever happened. There will still be those guys, those Japanese soldiers holding out on the island long after World War II ended. And the reason he says this, and it was such a good point, is there are people, let's say, if you're a transgender individual and you've, let's say, gone on hormones, or you've you revealed this to your family and they disowned you, or your wife divorced you, or maybe you even went through the surgery or something. If you were to then sit back and realize, hang on a minute, this was all a lie. None of this was true. I was never what I thought I was. And actually, I just blew up my entire life and destroyed my physical body for no reason at all. That people can't handle that. Like your mind
Yeah.
can, I mean, some people can, and fair play to those people. They have a lot of strength and they deserve a huge amount of admiration and respect. But that is just unthinkable for a lot of people. And similarly, let's say you are a parent and you encouraged or facilitated your child going down that route, or like a close friend or close relative of yours. Again, then you would have to accept, I ruined my child's life. Like I've actually destroyed them as a person, and that was a decision that I made, and I'm fully responsible. Like people just cannot deal with that as a reality. So there is a certain cohort of people who will literally go to their graves fully convinced of this in their own mind, because the alternative is just too horrifying to contemplate.
Well, this is why the detransitioners are such an important element in all of this. The people who, similarly to how you outlined, went through, say, hormonal treatment, even got surgeries to cut off breasts, to add a essentially prosthetic penis and things like this. They're really important because they're people who have gone to the very edge of this ideology, and they've had the courage and the strength, and they really are very admirable individuals to acknowledge that they took a wrong turn and to begin the painful process of heading back in the other direction of recovery. And, people at the cutting edge of this philosophy really are sort of between a rock and a hard place, because you've got two options. It's like, okay, either admit that you were wrong, which comes with a whole load of suffering. And I follow some of them on X, and like, it really is heartbreaking stuff. There's one young woman in particular, say, who thought she was a boy, and so she got her breasts cut off. She has obviously since detransitioned, she's become a mother, and she very much feels the desire to breastfeed her child, but she can't anymore. And it is with things like this that I genuinely have no hesitation in calling the people who promote and facilitate this unflinchingly evil, because they have done massive, concrete, direct damage to the lives of who knows how many impressionable young people. So you've got that one side of things, people who have to begin the painful process of recovery, but then you've got the other side. It's like, the people who are sort of unrepentant in this, to put it that way, or sort of continue to think that this is the way for them to be who they really are. And I don't know whether I just have limited reading, although I don't think so. I've very rarely seen a success story with a transition or anything like this. I remember reading Douglas Murray's, I think, Madness of Crowds, where he did point out, a couple of very puzzling cases where, these are genuinely fringe cases, like one or two people in the literature, things like this, people who went through transitions and, they just genuinely couldn't have imagined doing things another way. And then I can't remember what happened with the rest of them, but essentially they were always convinced that was the right choice for them. But this is you don't build.
And sorry to interrupt you, but even in those cases, I would love to know the time frame we're talking about and how long did that feeling last. Because not to go off a tangent about I know this is a very separate thing, but it's like when people promote polyamory and having me and my multi-family relationship,
my lovers,
yeah, exactly. And look, we live in a household and we're all doing great. It's like, yeah, show me the group dynamic like that has functioned for, I was gonna say 10 years, 5 years. You know what I mean? Like, none of you people are gonna be like on your deathbed at the age of 90 having lived a long, happy life together. Like, this does not work. It might work for a week or 6 months at a push. It does not work long term. So anyway, my point being, I'm sure there are people who transition and think it's absolutely unreal. This is sick. Oh man, why didn't I do this earlier? Yeah, come back to that guy in a decade and tell me what's going on with him. I'd love to know.
No, 100%. And there's real nuances involved in this. But even irregardless of that, that those fringe cases, and we've completely forgotten this as a society, are not what you build your understanding of human sexuality on, which is obviously what's been happening. It's like these are genuinely, if they, exist and if there is longevity to them, genuinely extraordinarily fringe cases. And obviously that means, you don't you make these people social outcasts or anything like this, but it is to say that, yeah, you don't rewrite society on the basis of these exceptions. Because, the institutions that we have that have just been so trashed over the past decade in particular are all rooted in human nature. Like, yeah, to go with the polyamory example, like monogamy, and, people might say, oh, but you've got, polygamous societies and things like this. And it's like, well, there's plenty of reasons why they're inferior, I would put it that way, to monogamous societies. The same with like the basic understanding of, yeah, male and female, all of these different things. It's to bring it back to Sinn Féin, because we've gone on a bit of a tangent. Like, yeah, you're making a whole load of trouble for yourself if you try to if you're veering this, because this topic was the most mainstream attempt to veer very far from the truth, I would put it that way, because this stuff is real, like 2 + 2 = 5 stuff. And I think it was the most mainstream attempt to like force that level of disconnect from reality on a lot of people. And when you're a political party sort of trying to fit that into your manifesto, like, and again, Sinn Féin weren't alone in this, shouldn't make fun of them on that account, but good luck to you. And as I don't think it's going to be very long before the wheels come off it altogether in Ireland, as is happening elsewhere.
Yep, most definitely. And speaking of elsewhere, we've had a number of elections across the beautiful continent in which we inhabit, Europe. I wonder if you'd like to tell us a little bit about how it went for our friends in, what was it? There was Poland, where you reside, Portugal, and Romania, I believe, all coincided at the same time. What's going on in Europe land?
So yeah, across the board, it was very interesting. Because I literally just did the briefest news update on this today, because it was reported extensively elsewhere, and I was essentially just giving the rundown. But I would say it was a very good weekend for, and I'm using this as understanding as a broad umbrella, the right and sort of nationalists and conservatives, despite the sort of main loss in Romania for that camp. Because to just run through them very quickly. Romania was obviously super contentious in recent months. I think it was 5 months ago they annulled the results of their election that saw the outsider, and I can never remember how to pronounce his name, Kalin Georgescu, something along those lines. They annulled the very impressive result he got on the basis of Russian interference, and he's since been charged with a number of crimes. Who am I to speak to the validity of them? But I do find the whole thing very suspect personally. Anyway, so that was annulled, and they decided to rerun the presidential election. His protege, Georgescu's protege, Simeon, George Simeon, had done very well in an initial vote, but he lost yesterday to the centre-left mayor of Bucharest, who would very much be sort of Brussels man in Romania, Nicu Dan. And he, as I say, would be very sort of, he'd be EU facing, he would be NATO facing. I think Ukraine will have breathed a huge sigh of relief at his victory, because he'd pretty much sort of guarantee continued aid to them. So that was the situation in Romania. I think, again, the George Simeon conceded defeat. So whether there were hijinks in the background on this occasion, it's not really for you or I to say. So the main candidate conceded defeat. So anyway, the run up to that was very contentious and very messy, if you want to put it politely. Then in Portugal, you had the centre-right Democratic Alliance, which is led by the Prime Minister of the country, Luis Montenegro. They emerged as the winners, but they fell short of a majority. The surprise of that election, though, and this is similar in Poland, was the success of the right-wing element, the Chega party, which secured 22% of the vote, which tied it with the Socialist Party. They both secured 58 seats each.
I've heard them described as far right by the likes of the BBC and so on. And what's maddening and frustrating, we were talking about this off air, is that I don't know are they actually far right? Like, because far right parties do exist. There are genuine neo-Nazi
Yeah.
lunatics and maniacs who want to like kill people and put people in gas chambers and stuff. That like that does exist, but they also call everyone far right. So I don't
Yeah.
know when I'm looking at a country whose politics I'm not familiar with. Like, how am I act? Is this a real bad guy, or is this just somebody who believes that he has the same view on transgenderism as David Cullinane 2 weeks ago? Like, what are we dealing with here? You know?
No, yeah, I mean, not to go on too much of a tangent, but I've long described what we're living through at the moment as a definitional crisis, which is that, like, yeah, we just use words as they're not supposed to be used. It's like, yeah, far right is always applied to Gript, and it's like, we're not far right by any stretch of the imagination. I would say, like, I would say you and I are pretty mild guys, actually. I think if we're being called uncomfortable at all, certainly think our Orthodox Catholicism puts us sort of seriously out of step with the modern world. But it's just like, yeah, far right has been used to tarp, people from, say, David Cullinane's position 2 weeks ago to, Hitler copycats and things like this. It's essentially a useless term now. So yeah, I saw the Chega Party described as far right extensively as well. It doesn't necessarily mean anything to me. Like you, I wouldn't be overly au fait with Portuguese politics, but I understand that this was pretty groundbreaking because it was widely perceived as being an end to. I think that Chega's leader, André Ventura, said that it was an end to bipartisanship in Portugal, where I understand the Socialist Party and that Democratic Alliance has sort of dominated things for some time now. I didn't include this in the article, but I think it might take the wind slightly out of the Chega Party sails, because I think the sort of centre-right Democratic Alliance is already ruled out going into government with the Chega Party. So it's kind of the story of modern European politics. It's like the major success of right-wing parties and the unwillingness of establishment parties, whether they be centre-right, centre-left, left-wing, to go into power with any of those parties. Like, you obviously have the famous firewall in German politics. You have, the great success of the National Front. In France, there was it last year now? I can't even remember. And then you had, a coalition of, centrist and left-wing parties coming together to ensure they couldn't get into government. So, anyway, that's what happened in Portugal. And then finally in Poland, which obviously the one I'm most familiar with, it was the first round of voting in Poland's presidential election, and it saw, kind of predictably, I would say, it saw the liberal centrist candidate, who's the current mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski. He just edged the conservative nationalist candidate, Karol Nawrocki, but that doesn't really matter because they're both going ahead now into the runoff vote on June 1st. But again, the real story here, to people who might be sort of minded like us, was the success of the right-wing vote in Poland. The third and fourth place candidates in yesterday's vote were both right-wing candidates, and properly right-wing at that. You had Sławomir Mencen of Konfederacja, and you had Grzegorz Braun. And it's very, very likely that they're combined. I think it's like 20%, 21% of the vote will go to the conservative nationalist candidate Nawrocki. Whereas the other candidates, their vote only adds up to like 12% or something. That'll probably go to centrist liberal Trzaskowski. So that's going to be real neck and neck stuff on June 1st, with regard to which one of Nawrocki or Trzaskowski gets into office. In Poland, the president is an interesting office. I would say they've more power than the Irish president, but less than the American president. They can very effectively veto bills from the government, because our president obviously has that function as well, but he never uses it. Whereas in Poland, it's used extensively. Like the current sort of conservative aligned president, Andrzej Duda, he has been just vetoing legislation left, right, and centre from the sort of centrist liberal government led by Donald Tusk. So if they get their man in, say Rafał Trzaskowski, their legislation will just sort of have an easy pass through into law. Whereas if Peace is a man who's with a conservative nationalist, as I say, Nawrocki gets elected in, he'll once again be sort of a barrier against I would say more progressive policies. But to be honest, even Poland's center liberal government is nowhere near Western Europe. Like they tried to make the slightest changes to abortion legislation. It wasn't even to allow abortion in the same ways in Ireland. It was something to it was along the lines of, I don't know, in this very limited circumstance, it might be allowed. And they couldn't even get a majority on that in the government, despite them being in government. So it's a very, very different political playground over here. And I think that it'll be super interesting to see how this current election goes. But as I say, the strength of the right wing vote, because as I say, the Confederacja Party, they're a genuine right wing party in a way that we don't really have an analogy for in Ireland or in like they would be more right wing than Reform in the UK or things like this. And they won the 18 to 29-year-old vote in Poland. The sort of element of political polarization is there because the left-wing party then did very well with 18 to 29-year-olds as well. But again, this Confederacja Party topped it with them. And then Confederacja also did very well with 30 to 39-year-olds, I think it was. So based on that, you would say that, well, there's going to be a good deal of political polarization in Poland in the future, which is in keeping with the moment, but that the right-wing element will be dominant. So definitely, if I could sum it up as I think I tried to at the beginning, a mixed bag in terms of the current election, but it probably looks like a strong future for the right-wing vote in the same way as it does in Germany with AfD's success and in the UK with Reform's success. So there's political turbulence at the moment in Europe, no doubt about it.
Not even talking about, whether things go right or left or this party gets in or that party gets in, kind of taking 3 steps back from it all. Are you not a little bit jealous hearing about events happening in other countries? You know that meme, nothing ever happens, where things are just so samey? Does, on some level, as an Irish person, let's say Sinn Féin got in or something mad, like you had like a Sinn Féin Social Democrats PBP government or something. I'm not saying I would be thrilled about that personally, as taking off my impartial journalist hat and putting on my kind of ordinary guy with
citizen hat.
Yeah, my ordinary guy with opinions hat. I'm not saying I'd be jumping up and down with glee at that particular result, but there'd be something very, very different that would come out of that. It would be radically, it would give the whole country whiplash, basically, from the change. And I feel like other countries have mad results like that, where something crazy happens and some dark horse candidate or political party comes out of nowhere and sweeps the power. And we're so like boring and predictable here that you just know it's a foregone conclusion every time.
I think that's sort of that boringness and predictability. I've been thinking about this a lot recently because Ireland really is a bit of a political outlier. It seems to me, in relation to just the way in which politics operates in so many other places, we really seem, we can't really get into this because we don't have that long left now, and you could do a whole episode on this alone. But like, we're a very, and I don't say this condescendingly, I mean this because there is a condescending way you can use this word, but I don't mean this condescendingly, which is, it strikes me that we're a very materialistic society. I don't mean that in the sense that we're obsessed with flashy cars and money and things like this. More so in the sense that we are very concerned with material realities in Ireland, in that, housing, land, economics and things like this. And like, that's not to say that other countries are not also concerned about those things and those things don't have big sway. But I feel like these are insurmountable realities in Ireland in a way that, like, I don't know, ideology can play a lot more into votes in the US, for example, or even like in Germany, for example. That's very much a vibes-based political system at the moment. And I realize we're speaking about this at a fairly superficial level at the moment, so we only have a few minutes, but I really do think that, like, that's both a blessing and a curse. Why Ireland was able to remain sort of sane for so long in many ways, and why despite a lot of the sort of madness of the reigning zeitgeist, to use that word again, it isn't changing particularly fast because it's sort of tethered to, material realities and things. But it's all just to say that, I don't know. I certainly do see it. It's like things are changing rapidly elsewhere, whereas we seem to be sort of I don't know, plodding along as we have been. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, Groundhog Day all over again. But with that said, we enjoyed speaking to you all as per usual. We will be back next week for another exciting edition of the Long Game Podcast. So we look forward to seeing you all again, and God bless.
God bless.